Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of Louis XIV and French Absolutism. So today we are going to look at Louis XIV's economic policies, as well as the wars that are going to end up kind of completely bankrupting France as a result. So let's get into it. You should be following along in your guided notes. This is in the same, this will actually be a separate handout. It should be labeled 3.32. But if you are following along on the guided notes on Teams, then it's part of the same document. All right. So Louis XIV's finance minister is going to be the real driving force behind Louis's economic policies, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Colbert, not Stephen Colbert, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And he was the controller of all of France's general finances under Louis XIV. He basically financially managed the entire royal government. He directed administration, taxation, public works, and his main goal is going to be to rigorously apply mercantilist policies to the French economy. He was a big proponent of mercantilism. And we've talked about mercantilism before, but Colbert's real main goal with mercantilism was the self-sufficiency of the French economy. He did not want France to have to rely on other countries for their economy. He wanted France to maximize the amount of money that it was making through its economy without having to rely on other countries for things like trade. And in order to do so, he supported the standardization of old industries, things that had, maybe been falling by the wayside, but that needed an update. And he also helped establish new industries, like the textile industry in France, in order to support exports, right? Because one of the big things about mercantilism is you want to minimalize imports, things you're trading with other countries for, things that you get. But you want to maximize the amount of stuff that you are selling to other countries. So things like these textiles to be exported. And he also reinforced the system of state inspection and regulation. If you'll remember, a lot of mercantilism is all about the control and power of the central state bureaucracy. And he made sure that that was reinforced and standardized so that it could do a good job of making sure that all of that wealth is going into the French economy, or the economy of the French government specifically. And he was a big proponent of things like no domestic tariffs. That's taxes on trade within France. But really high tariffs on foreign goods, taxes on things coming into France. And all of that is meant to maximize the economic input into the French economy, right? Because if merchants have to pay lots of taxes along the road within France, then they are going to be less likely to do lots of trade within France. But if you get rid of all those internal taxes, then that's going to encourage a lot of trade within France, and all of that is going into the French economy. Meanwhile, you want to discourage imported goods so you don't have to rely on other countries, but with the knowledge that you're going to have to get some stuff from other countries. And so you put these very high tariffs on them to discourage it, and also so that any money that is coming in through those imports is going directly to the French government. And so all of this, again, is meant to maximize that economic input into the French economy. And in order to do so, he improved infrastructure, set up those new economies like the textile industry, and he's going to support the creation of a very powerful merchant marine, a big merchant navy, in order to do all of this overseas trading. And this is going to be initially very, very successful. Colbert is a classic example of a finance minister who really saw the benefits of mercantilism for a European country during this time period. However, he is going to have a bit of an obstacle in all of Louis XIV's expenses, because, as we talked about yesterday, Louis XIV was a very expensive king, not just because of Versailles and the life of luxury that Louis was establishing, but also because of all the wars that Louis is going to be involved in, and we're going to talk about those next. And of course, wars rely on taxation, like we've talked about, and that taxation is going to start to weigh really, really heavily on the French peasantry. And they're going to start to get very, very upset about the amount that they are being taxed for all of these ridiculous wars. We're also going to see tons and tons of political offices being sold. We talked a bit about the creation of those new aristocratic families who are loyal to the king through the selling of these offices, but it's also a way of making money for the French crown in order to support these wars and to support the lifestyle of Versailles. But the problem is you have to give some special privileges with these political offices, and that's going to include exempting the people who purchased these offices from future taxation. And so what that means is eventually down the line you're going to have less tax revenue coming from the wealthy nobles, and so more tax revenue is going to have to come from the lower classes, and they are not going to be happy about that. And we're going to see 40,000 political offices sold in this method over the course of Louis's reign. And all of this this money is going to eventually lead France to have very bad credit with banks, lots of debt, in order to fund these wars, kind of like how we talked about with the Spanish kings, like Philip II. We're going to see France start to accrue a huge amount of debt in order to support all of these wars and all the luxury of Versailles. And those economic policies and all of the taxation that's weighing heavily on the peasantry, the symbolism of Versailles as this life of luxury, completely separate from the oppressed, overly taxed French people, all of that might start to sound a little familiar, because we are starting to get the beginnings of the kinds of situation that is going to eventually lead down the line to the French Revolution. Now, that isn't going to be until Unit 5. We have to get to the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution first, but start to think about how these policies are going to eventually come back to bite the French monarchy in the butt in a good, at this point, less than 100 years. So take a minute, pause the video if you need, and respond to this question. How did Jean-Baptiste Colbert's economic policies influence the success of Louis XIV's absolute rule? So let's go ahead and talk about Louis XIV's wars. This is going to be kind of, aside from Versailles and the whole concept of the Sun King, this is going to be one of his major legacies, is all of these wars. And as we've talked about before, for a European monarch, war generally equals power. And Louis is going to very much take that to heart. France was at war for 33 of the 54 years of Louis's reign. And that is going to be, that's a long time. And Louis really desired an increase in royal power and glory, right? The conquering in the name of France was conquering in the name of Louis, and that was, enhancing his reputation at the same time it was enhancing the reputation of France, right? L'État c'est moi. I am the state. I am France. Anything that was conquered for France was conquered for Louis, and that would then, increase the glory of the French name and the name of Louis. And Louis's overall goal with these wars was to expand France to what he viewed as its natural borders in order to protect it from invasion. Because Louis's military advisors believed that France was really vulnerable to an attack unless it expanded to these borders. And generally that is going to be up to the Rhine River in generally the borders that we recognize as modern France today. And one major outcome of this policy and of the response that we're going to see from the other European nations around Louis is a very modern-looking international balance of power principle, where other European powers are going to ally together in order to check the growing power of one very powerful ruler. We're going to see this again and again throughout the rest of European history. We'll see this with Napoleon, we'll see this with Hitler, with somebody in Central Europe expanding their borders and conquering, and a lot of other nations in Europe allying together despite their differences in order to make sure that that one power doesn't take too much territory and become too powerful. Now, all of Louis's military conquests are going to be aided by that new military that we briefly mentioned yesterday. It's going to be under the command of François Letellier. We'll see new standards of discipline, uniforms, and training. It's going to be the largest standing peacetime army in Europe. Because remember, having that standing army that doesn't just come together when it's time for war, but is there whenever you need it, is a major aspect of that power that comes from control of the state military. And Louis, along with Letellier, really believed that the army was the foundation of French power. And so if you are going to ensure French power, you have to ensure that the French military is as good as it could possibly be. So let's go ahead and actually look at some of these wars. Starting with the War of Devolution, which lasted from 1667 to 1668. And for all of these wars, I've divided it up into what the general goals of the wars were, some major events that happened, and then the outcome, along with the name of the treaty. And there's one main treaty, and there's one main war that we're going to talk about, the War of Spanish Succession. That's going to be the most important one to know here. So the War of Devolution was an invasion of the Spanish-controlled Netherlands, as well as the territory of Franche-Comté. And that is because Louis was concerned with the threat of Spanish power on the French frontier in the north. And it's called the War of Devolution because Louis used the idea that the Spanish king had failed to pay the dowry for Louis's new Spanish bride as an excuse for the war. And so he argued that all of those lands that were controlled by Spain should devolve to Louis because the Spanish king had failed to pay that dowry. So it's the War of Devolution because he basically said, okay, if you aren't going to pay the dowry, then I'm going to, lay claim to these territories. Now, whether that's a good argument or not, that kind of isn't the point, right? And we're going to start to see that balance of power principle come into play here, because we're going to see a triple alliance form. We're under events now. A triple alliance form between the Dutch, the English, and the Swedes in order to make sure that Louis doesn't get too much power during the War of Devolution. And they're going to manage to force Louis to sue for peace as a result of that balance of power alliance. And this is going to lead to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, where Louis is eventually just only going to be able to acquire a few towns in the Spanish Netherlands. After all of that, he just gets a few towns in the Spanish Netherlands and has to go back home without having really achieved the goal that he had wanted. He's also now going to really, really resent the Dutch for forming this alliance, and that is going to lead directly into the next war that we're going to see. That is called the Dutch War, which lasted from 1672 to 1678. And Louis's goal here is going to be to break that alliance that had formed during the War of Devolution. He wanted to break that alliance between the English, the Dutch, and the Swedish. And he is going to do this in a very clever way, which is he's going to convince the King of England, who is Charles II at the time, to side with the French and break that alliance. And Charles had some very legitimate economic reasons for going along with this. The Dutch were really dominating the international trading economy at this point, and they were becoming a serious rival to England. We've talked about that when we were talking about the Age of Exploration. And so Charles is going to see an opportunity to weaken the Dutch here, even if it means siding with Louis. Now, in retaliation, the Dutch are going to ally with the Spanish in order to achieve that balance of power, even though England had just screwed them over. And some events from this war, we're going to see Jean-Baptiste Colbert actually be pretty influential here, because he's going to set up a series of trade barriers to try and weaken the Dutch economy. That, using those tariffs, those trade barriers, those economic policies that was his specialty to try and hurt the Dutch trading economy. However, he's not going to be very successful at this, and he is not going to be able to make much of a dent in all of the wealth that the Dutch had been acquiring and were still acquiring from their overseas trade. And we're going to see France invade the Netherlands, led personally by King Louis during this war. But the Dutch are going to have a pretty clever way of combating the French here. The Netherlands is very low, is actually below sea level, and so it has these dikes, which are basically big giant walls that hold the sea back so it doesn't completely flood the Netherlands. And the Dutch are going to open the dikes in order to flood the countryside against the French, so the French couldn't invade any further. And you can kind of see that in this painting down here. And once again, we're going to see that balance of power principle forming. And this time we're going to see an alliance of German forces, Spain, and Austria all allying with the Dutch in order to try and force Louis to end the war. And the outcome we're going to see here, represented by the Peace of Nijmegen, was once again a couple small gains for France. Louis was able to receive the territory of Franche-Comté, but not the entirety of the Netherlands by far. And that is going to be, it's some gains, but it is not nearly enough to justify the expense of this war, because Louis is spending a huge amount of money on all of these wars in order to support his very powerful military. Next, we're going to see the War of the League of Augsburg, also called the 9 Years' War. And this is going to last from 1689 to 1697. The goal of this war for Louis was to take advantage of the weakness of the Habsburgs, who were really on their way out at this point in Europe. but they're still kicking. He also became very worried about an increase in Dutch power when the Dutch king, William of Orange, is also going to become the King of England. Now, we're going to get to that later when we talk about England towards the end of the unit. But yeah, the Dutch king is going to become the English king, and that is obviously going to really, really boost the power of the Dutch. And some events we're going to see during this war, we're going to see France annex Alsace and Lorraine, which is a territory between France and Germany that was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a territory that's going to trade hands between France and Germany a lot over the course of European history. And we're once again going to see a new coalition form against France. This time it's the League of Augsburg, which was Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, what remained of it, the Netherlands, Sweden, and England, all fighting against France. And with that balance of power principle, they're going to be able to pool their resources and fight France into a stalemate. Now, it should be noted that the fact that like 5 countries have to team up against just France for all of these wars is a testament to how powerful Louis's military was. He's losing, but he was, a serious force to be reckoned with. The outcome of this war was the Peace of Ryswick, and this is going to once again be pretty bad for France. France is going to have to give up all of its previous conquests, although it will be able to keep just Alsace. So once again, France gets a little bit of territory, but not nearly enough to justify the expenses. And as a result of this, we're going to see a huge amount of economic depression and famine in France, just because of the amount of resources that were getting pumped into this war. And as we see, this is not going to be anywhere close to the level of success that would justify something like that. So finally, we get to the War of Spanish Succession, and this is going to be the big one. This is going to be the longest and hardest fought war over the course of Louis's reign. And the goal here is actually going to be related to our good old friend El Hechizado, the Charles II of Spain, that, end result of all of the Habsburg incest, because he, unsurprisingly, is going to die childless. And there's going to be a question of, okay, now who is going to inherit the Spanish throne? Now, Charles named the grandson of Louis XIV as his successor. But Leopold I, who was in control of the Holy Roman Empire, and we'll talk about him a bit later, also laid claim to the throne of Spain because everybody is related to everybody, and he argued that he actually should inherit the Spanish throne. And this is going to have the potential to upset the balance of power in Europe, because if the Spanish and French thrones get combined here, then all of the Spanish possessions in the Americas, in Italy, all of that is also going to be added to France under Louis XIV, and that is going to be a serious juggernaut to contend with. And so we're going to see, once again, that the rest of Europe is going to be very, very concerned about Louis gaining too much power. And once again, we're going to see another classic clash between the French kings and the Habsburgs, this time, after the height of the Holy Roman Empire, because this is after the 30 Years' War. But we are going to see that the Habsburgs are still going to be trying to counteract French power and vice versa. And some events we're going to see in this war is, once again, everybody is going to side together against Louis. This one is called the Grand Alliance. The English, the Dutch, the Austrians, and the Prussians, and we'll talk about those latter two tomorrow, all allied against France in order to try and make sure that Louis doesn't get control of all of Spain and its holdings. And that means France is going to have to fight on several fronts at once. Now, as usual, France is going to have to impose crushing taxes in order to pay for this war, which this time is going to start to lead to a series of major revolts in France. And that is, again, going to show how expensive and destabilizing all these wars were. And the outcome of this war is the big important one to know, the Peace of Utrecht. Now, Leopold I, who had laid claim to the Spanish throne, which had started the war, died, and so he didn't get to inherit anything. And the French Philip of Anjou was able to inherit the Spanish throne. He became King Philip V of Spain, and this was a victory for Louis. However, the Peace of Utrecht made sure that to specify that the French and Spanish crowns could never be united. And so even if Louis had an ally in Spain, he could never gain control over Spain in the way that he had wanted. The Austrian Habsburgs were given the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sardinia, and Milan, so a lot of these Spanish holdings in Italy and in the Netherlands. Also, importantly, France, as a result of this, is going to have to surrender its North American territories to England. And that is going to have major repercussions on the American side of the Atlantic, because we're going to see this really lead to England's dominance in Atlantic trade and in the colonization of North America. It's no longer really, a competition between Spain, England, and France. It is at this point, England really dominating in the colonization of North America. And once again, this is going to be a classic kind of nail in the coffin in that balance of power principle. The whole point of the Peace of Utrecht was to make sure that Louis couldn't become too powerful for the other powers of Europe to contend with. It's also, this war is going to complete the decline of Spain as a great power. Basically, this war was fought to pick apart what was left of Spain. Spain didn't really have a whole lot of say in it, and we're really going to see Spain kind of as a goal as opposed to a player in this war. And this is also going to end the French expansionist policies under Louis. And that is because 2 years after this war, Louis finally died in 1715. And that is going to be it for him, and so that's going to be it for all these wars that was such a key part of his reign. But also, there's a reason why his successors aren't going to keep doing the same thing. Louis absolutely bankrupted France in these wars. France was at the brink of financial ruin. Why it do that? I don't know. This is where we see the French crown have to sell 40,000 political offices just to pay for the war. And like we talked about earlier, those offices don't have to pay taxes, and so that's only further going to hurt the French economy. And we are really going to see this kind of as the culmination of the financial ruin that France is going to see as a result of all of these wars. So, was it worth it, Louis? I'm not really sure. Probably not in the end. And here is a map just to give you an idea of the territory that was taken during this time period. In orange, we can see Louis XIV here. So everything in orange is stuff that Louis managed to conquer. And again, is it's a chunk of territory, but was it worth completely bankrupting France? I don't know. So I want you to finish off this lesson by responding to this. Would you argue that Louis XIV was an effective or ineffective monarch, and why? And think back to what we talked about yesterday and what we talked about today. Was he effective? Was he ineffective? How would you define whether he was effective or ineffective? Finally, after you respond to this, I want you to go back and find those 5 most important topics and explain why they are important to understanding how Louis contributed to absolute monarchy in Europe during this time period. And that is going to be both for the first part of this lesson yesterday and for this part. All right, that is all from me. I will talk to you guys again tomorrow for the next lesson when we get to 3.4. Have a great day, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.